they're all compared to people that are religiously unaffiliated. So evangelicals are compared to the unaffiliated, mainliners are, Catholics are, Jewish people are, people of other faiths are, and people of some other Protestant denominations are all compared to people that are religiously unaffiliated. So the first column we're looking at, one more thing to add. I also control for a host of socio-demographic variables, so gender, education, income, region, the standard socio-demographic variables I control for. But in this table right here, I just put the main independent variables. There's just not enough space. One more thing to add. The asterisks indicate if there is a significant relationship between the independent and dependent variable. So I'll explain what's going on right here. So in this first column right here, this attendance column, we're looking at the relationship between religious affiliation and cohort on worship attendance. And what we see here is that religious affiliated evangelicals, mainliners, Catholic, Jewish individuals, people of other faiths, and people from other Protestant denominations, they are all more likely to attend worship services than religious unaffiliated, which is not too surprising. We also see here that people that came of age in the pre-civil rights era, the civil rights era, and the pre-civil rights and civil rights era are more likely to attend worship services than people that came of age during the 1980s and 1990s. There's no difference in worship attendance among the post-civil rights cohort and the Generation X and Y cohort. So that's the first column. So in the next column, we're attempting to assess the degree to which religious affiliation and cohort partly explain this connection that we observed between worship attendance and opposition to open housing. And so what we see here is that in the reduced model, before we take into account cohort and religious affiliation, we find that the more whites attend worship services, the more likely they are to oppose open housing. Right here. I mean, it's significant at the 0.001 level. So high level significant. However, when we take into account age cohort, the original effect is reduced to the point of non-significance. No longer related to open housing. We do find, however, that people that came of age during the pre-civil rights, civil rights, and post-civil rights era are more likely to oppose open housing than people that came of age during the Generation X period. In the next column right here, this is the religious affiliation column. And we see here that when we take into account religious affiliation, there is still a connection between worship attendance and open housing at the 0.01 level of significance. However, this relationship is weaker than was initially reported in the reduced model. We also find that evangelical Protestants, mainline Protestants, and Catholics are more likely than religious unaffiliated to oppose open housing. There's no difference between people of Jewish faith, other faiths, and other Protestant denominations and religious affiliation on their views on open housing. In the full model, we find that once we take into account religious affiliation and cohort, we again find that the initial relationship that we observed is reduced to the point of non-significance. And again, we see these same relationships. Evangelical Protestants, mainline Protestants, and Catholics are more likely than religious unaffiliated to oppose open housing. And people that came of age during the pre-civil rights, civil rights, and post-civil rights era are more likely to oppose open housing than people that came of age during the Generation X and Y period. This figure right here illustrates what I was just talking about. So the blue line right here is the relationship between worship attendance and probability of opposing open housing before we take into account age cohort and religious affiliation. And you can see that before we take into account, we see the relationship, positive relationship. The more people attend, going from never attending to attending once a week, the greater the probability of people saying that they oppose open housing. However, when we take into account religious affiliation and age cohort, this is a full model right here, we don't see a relationship. It's flat. This line does not move. So the idea again is that the connection between worship attendance and opposition to open housing is a function of cohort and religious affiliation. Now, among blacks and Hispanic connection tables, we don't see relationships. We do see that, just as was the case among whites, that religious affiliated, evangelicals, mainliners, Catholics, black Protestants, other faiths are more likely to attend than the religious unaffiliated, and older individuals, people that came of age in the pre-civil rights, civil rights, and post-civil rights era, are more likely to attend than people that came of age in the Generation X and Y period. But we don't see a connection at all between worship attendance and opposition to open housing. And before we take into account the religious affiliation and age cohort, and when we begin to take these variables into account, we still see nothing. Same thing is the case with Hispanics. No relationship, non-significant relationships here. Pretty much nothing going on. And that's non-significant. So we do not observe a connection between worship attendance and opposition to open housing among Hispanics. And again, as I stated earlier, I ran these models, but 6 other dependent variables, and the patterns come out essentially the same. So in sum, for whites, religious affiliation and age cohort impact the relationship between worship attendance and racial segregation attitudes. Secular and younger whites attend worship services less often and are more likely to oppose racial segregation. Consequently, worship attendance on average increases support for racial segregation among whites. However, when secular and younger whites attend at the same rate as others, attendance increases opposition to racial segregation, to the point where we don't see a connection. For blacks and Hispanics, however, age cohort, religious affiliation, and worship attendance are largely unrelated to racial segregation attitudes. So for whites, questions about dominance and marginalization among the secular and young adults likely contribute to progressive racial attitudes. These groups also tend to possess more critical attitudes about religious institutions, and this likely contributes to the lower attendance rates, which in part explains why worship attendance contributes to increased support for racial segregation. That is, the groups of whites, younger whites, and religiously unaffiliated that hold the most progressive racial attitudes, these individuals attend less often. The fact that racial integration extends socioeconomic opportunities to racial and ethnic minorities likely contributes to age cohort, religious affiliation, and worship attendance, having a limited impact on the racial segregation attitudes of blacks and Hispanics. In conclusion, I'd like to make the case that one, religious congregations are voluntary institutions. And as voluntary institutions, the voluntary nature of religious congregations largely constrains the ability of congregational leaders to influence entrenched attitudes such as race. So, hearing messages about race is not likely to alter attitudes of racial and ethnic minorities, because they're likely hearing messages about the necessity or the importance of racial equality, which individuals inside and outside congregations largely believe. Alternatively, on average, worship attendance contributes to heightened support for racial segregation among whites. Now, this is not to suggest that white congregations that attempt to change racial attitudes are facing an impossible battle, but they do likely face serious challenges. Okay, thank you. Go ahead.
That's really interesting. I guess I wonder if you are arguing that original association between attending service and, being more opposed to racial integration. Are you arguing that's a selection, that it's a spurious association, it's just a selection process?
Yes.
Or are you arguing that it's like a moderation where it's fundamentally different? So I guess, did you look at like interactions between the younger whites? So among the younger white cohorts, was there just no effect